On August 6, 1945, six B-29 bombers took off from a Pacific Ocean base for a fateful mission. Three planes flew ahead to assess weather conditions at potential targets. Of the remaining three, one plane carried observers, another carried instruments, and the last carried a payload that would change history. As they reached the designated target, the attack plane initiated the bombing run. The plane had a good view of Hiroshima, an industrial city. After the weather forecast triggered an early morning air warning, people were beginning their day waiting for the tram or entering school. Then, in a devastating flash, it was over. The bomb vaporized thousands of people on the spot, with their organs boiling in their bodies. Many more died from the burns caused by the initial fireball, falling debris, and radiation. The bomb hit 50% of the city's population and marked the beginning of the nuclear age. 3 days later, a second bombing run obliterated a residential neighborhood in Nagasaki. Estimates of casualties there ranged from 40,000 to 70,000 dead. Hiroshima and Nagasaki are forever connected to the atomic bombings, as it was the only time nuclear bombs were used in warfare. The question of why these two cities were chosen is often raised. They were not as significant as Tokyo or Osaka and did not house the most critical war industry. The reasoning is grim and relates to the deadliest air raid in history. But first, we have to talk about the context. In May 1945, World War II was coming to an end, with Germany's surrender in Europe. However, the war continued in the Pacific as the United States was locked in a protracted and costly conflict with Japan. The US military had been working on a top-secret project to develop a nuclear weapon to bring the war to an end. Although they had conducted tests, they wanted to witness the actual use of this powerful new weapon. The US forces were engaged in a brutal island-hopping campaign in the Pacific with significant battles such as Guadalcanal, Midway, Wake Island, and Iwo Jima. After these victories, the American military set its sights on the Japanese home islands, with Okinawa as a major stepping stone. The Battle of Okinawa proved to be a harrowing and blood-soaked campaign. The Japanese defenders were resolute, and their tactic was to fight to the death rather than surrender. This extreme resistance, along with the massive casualties, deeply concerned the American military. The US had to consider the potential cost of invading mainland Japan, estimating anywhere from tens of thousands to 250,000 dead and wounded American soldiers. At this point, the newly developed nuclear weapon became a compelling option. Dropping the bomb on a Japanese city was chosen as a way to demonstrate its power. However, the question was which city to target. A committee was formed to decide the criteria for selecting the target city. They considered factors like a large urban area, a location between Tokyo and Nagasaki, and high strategic value. Based on these criteria, a list of 17 potential target areas were compiled. The committee tasked with choosing the cities had to weigh various factors, including strategic importance and potential for demonstrating the bomb's power. While Kyoto might seem like an unlikely target due to its cultural significance, the priority at the time was to end the war swiftly, and concerns about preserving cultural heritage were secondary. The committee initially considered 17 targets but narrowed them down to 4: Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, and Nagasaki. In the end, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were chosen as the two cities to be targeted. Tokyo was not included on the final list because it had been subjected to conventional firebombing raids, which had already resulted in significant destruction and loss of life. The US had used firebombing tactics in various Japanese cities, leading to widespread devastation. The decision makers may have believed that further bombing of Tokyo was not as strategically significant as targeting other cities. The reference to the bombing of Dresden in Germany illustrates the devastating impact of firebombing campaigns. Dresden was firebombed by Allied forces, and the resulting firestorms caused widespread destruction and casualties, despite the city's limited military significance. This serves as an example of the brutal and destructive tactics employed in World War II by all sides. The map of Germany's destroyed cities demonstrates the extensive damage caused by the bombing campaigns across the country. The shift in bombing tactics during World War II, particularly the switch to nighttime area bombing of cities, indeed raised complex moral and ethical questions. The deliberate targeting of civilian populations, as opposed to specific military and industrial targets, became a matter of policy, especially for British and American forces. Both sides have the aim of destroying cities, killing workers, and causing mass destruction of lives. The approach was to break the morale of the population and force surrender. Firebombing, in particular, was designed to create firestorms and maximize destruction within urban areas. The policy of intentionally targeting civilians as a means of winning the war was a controversial and heavily debated aspect of World War II. The bombings caused enormous civilian casualties and devastation, and they raised moral and legal questions about the acceptable limits of warfare. You might be wondering how this relates to Japan. Well, firebombing is the connection. The US Air Force believed that intensive bombing could force Japan to surrender, so they began firebombing, and Japan was particularly vulnerable to firebombing due to its houses primarily being constructed from wood and paper. The use of napalm bombs designed to destroy individual houses was widespread. American bombing of Japanese cities began in 1944, but a significant challenge they faced was the dispersed nature of Japan's war industry. Unlike Germany, Japan's war industry was spread out in smaller towns and cities, making it difficult to target specific industrial centers. Consequently, a large number of B-29 bombers were used to attack various cities across Japan. In one devastating raid in March 1945, B-29 swarmed over Tokyo, causing massive destruction and resulting in the deaths of around 100,000 people. This remains one of the deadliest air raids in history, surpassing even the initial casualties of the atomic bombs dropped later. By the summer of 1945, Tokyo was left in ruins. The city became almost unrecognizable. As for the targeting committee, they encountered a significant problem. Their strategy involved systematically bombing cities to the point where not a single building was left standing. Tokyo was taken off their list as it had already been heavily bombed and reduced to rubble, with only the palace grounds remaining as a recognizable feature. The targeting committee faced a significant problem because they needed a relatively intact city to demonstrate the destructive power of the atomic bombs to Japan and the world. However, there was a conflict of interest between the committee's goals and the Air Force's priorities. The Air Force did not want to reserve targets solely for the Manhattan Project. As a result, cities like Yokohama, initially on the list, were removed because they were firebombed at the end of May. This led to an unusual situation where the targeting committee had to request the Air Force to stop bombing cities because they were running out of targets. This issue reached the highest levels of the US government, with the Secretary of War expressing concerns for two reasons. First, he feared that the Allies might be seen as bad as the Germans due to extensive bombings, and second, he was concerned that Japan had already been bombed so much that a new weapon wouldn't be able to showcase its strength. The president found this situation somewhat ironic and chuckled, possibly missing the contradiction between the two statements. If you look at the map of Japan, you can understand the Secretary of War's worries, as it shows the scale of destruction caused by US firebombing. A total of 69 cities were firebombed, with major cities like Osaka, Nagoya, and Tokyo heavily damaged, and smaller cities like Fukuyama, Takeshima, and Toyama nearly obliterated. It's estimated that this bombing killed approximately 500,000 people, and 15 million people were left without homes at the end of the war. One of the principal aims of bombing civilians was to make them stop fighting and pressure their government to end the war. However, it turns out that this approach is ineffective. Instead of becoming more compliant, people tend to become more resistant when subjected to bombing campaigns. So this argument is no longer viable. So at the end, both Hiroshima and Nagasaki had significant military importance, and they were still intact from firebombing. Hiroshima was an important military command and communications center containing a significant number of troops and was a key assembly point for shipping. Nagasaki wasn't even the primary target. On August 9, the primary target was Kokura, but it was obscured by clouds, so target B was Nagasaki. I suppose fate has its own weather forecast.